Nova Scotia. The name makes a claim before a single fact gets presented. New Scotland, an entire Canadian province branded after a country most of its residents, according to family lore and tourism brochures alike, once called home. Highland games fill summer calendars. Gaelic still appears on road signs across parts of Cape Breton. Bagpipes aren't a novelty here. They're closer to a civic reflex. For generations, the story told about this stretch of Atlantic Canada has stayed remarkably consistent. Highland Scots, pushed off their land by the clearances, rebuilt something like Scotland's soul on foreign shores, and their descendants carry that identity forward almost unbroken. Recent genetic and historical research, however, is asking a question the heritage industry rarely raises out loud. What if that Highland identity, as central as it feels today, was never the dominant thread running through the population's actual ancestry? Start with the numbers historians actually have. Scottish immigration to Nova Scotia surged mainly after 1770, accelerating through the early 1800s as Highland clearances forced tenant farmers off ancestral land across Scotland. Ships like the Hector, which landed at Pictou in 1773, have become near-mythical touchstones, celebrated in museums, reenactments, plaques. That single voyage is often treated, informally, as a founding moment for Scottish Nova Scotia. It's a compelling story. It's also, on its own, a fairly small sample size for a population now numbering nearly 1 million people who trace at least part of their family tree back centuries earlier than 1773. Because here's the detail the Highland narrative tends to skip past. Europeans had already been settling, fighting over, and repopulating this land for more than 150 years before a single Highland ship arrived at Pictou. French colonists had built farming communities along the Bay of Fundy since 1604. British and New England settlers had already moved onto that same land by the 1760s. German-speaking Protestants had founded an entire town on the south shore a full generation before the clearances even began. And long before any European vessel reached these shores, the Mi'kmaq had lived across this territory for roughly 13,000 years, with a presence in the region's genetic and cultural fabric that predates every other group by millennia. So when modern DNA studies started sampling Nova Scotian populations and comparing the results against the province's cultural self-image, something didn't line up. The genetic signal wasn't dominated by Highland Scotland the way the tartans and the tourism slogans suggested it should be. Something else was sitting underneath the surface, older, more layered, and considerably harder to fit onto a postcard. To understand what that underlying signal actually represents, the timeline has to go back far earlier than any European ship. The Mi'kmaq, whose territory the British would later call Nova Scotia, had occupied this land since roughly 9000 BCE, according to archaeological evidence stretching from the Bay of Fundy to Cape Breton. Their presence wasn't a prelude to the real history that followed. It was the foundation everything else was built on top of, a continuous cultural and genetic thread running through the region for longer than most nations on Earth have existed at all. European contact arrived in the early 1600s, and it didn't come for Scotland first. It came from France. In 1604, French settlers established Port Royal, and over the following century, Acadian farmers spread along the marshlands of the Bay of Fundy, developing a distinctive system of diking and agriculture that let them farm reclaimed tidal soil. By the 1750s, an estimated 14,000 Acadians lived across what is now Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. They intermarried, in documented instances, with Mi'kmaq communities, and they built a culture that was neither purely French nor purely indigenous, but something regionally distinct. Then, in 1755, the British colonial government ordered their removal. Historians call it the expulsion or Le Grand Derangement. Thousands of Acadians were forced onto ships and scattered, to Louisiana, to France, to other British colonies, some dying in transit from disease and overcrowded conditions. Nova Scotia's official memory largely treats this as a closed chapter. The Acadians left, the land was later resettled by others, and a new population took shape. Except the DNA doesn't fully agree with that clean ending. Genetic and genealogical research conducted in recent years has traced Acadian maternal and paternal lines still present in Nova Scotia's modern population. Descendants of families who were never deported at all, who hid in forests and remote coves during the roundups, or who eventually made their way back decades later once tensions eased. Some blended quietly into English or Scottish surnamed households through intermarriage, their Acadian ancestry surviving genetically long after it stopped being recorded or acknowledged in family names. This raises a harder question than simple population replacement. If Acadian ancestry never fully left, if it persisted underneath surnames that sound Scottish or English today, then the tidy story of expulsion followed by resettlement was never as complete as the history books implied. And if that's true for the Acadians, it opens up an uncomfortable possibility about who else got folded into Nova Scotia's population without ever making it into the province's dominant cultural narrative. That possibility gets stronger the further the investigation moves through the region's layer migrations. After the Acadians were expelled, the British colonial government needed people to work the newly emptied farmland, and it found them close by. Between 1759 and 1768, thousands of settlers arrived from New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, lured by free land grants and the promise of the same fertile, diked marshland the Acadians had spent generations reclaiming. Historians call this wave the New England Planters, and by some estimates they eventually outnumbered every other founding European group in the region, including the Scots who would arrive decades later. Their descendants remain deeply embedded in Nova Scotia's population today, yet planter heritage rarely gets a festival, a tartan, or a tourism campaign built around it. Around the same period, in 1753, a different group landed at Merleguash Bay. Several thousand German, Swiss, and French Protestant settlers recruited by the British to found the town of Lunenburg. Their language, architecture, and surnames still shape the South Shore today, showing up in modern genetic surveys as a distinct, concentrated signature largely separate from the Highland story altogether. Then came 1783, and one of the least publicized chapters in the province's founding population, roughly 3,000 Black Loyalists, formerly enslaved people who had sided with the British during the American Revolution in exchange for a promise of freedom and land, arrived in Nova Scotia and founded communities including Birchtown, near Shelburne, at the time, one of the largest free Black settlements anywhere in North America. Their descendants remain part of Nova Scotia's population today, carrying a documented genetic and cultural lineage that predates the Highland Scots by nearly a full generation, and whose history has been comparatively underrepresented in the province's public identity ever since. Only after all of this, after the Mi'kmaq, the Acadians, the Planters, the Lunenburg Germans, and the Black Loyalists had already shaped the region for over a century and a half, did the wave most associated with New Scotland actually arrive in significant numbers. Highland immigration accelerated mainly from the 1770s onward, intensifying through the early 19th century as the clearances pushed tenant farmers off land that had, in many cases, been in their families for generations. It was a real, often traumatic migration, and it left a lasting cultural imprint. But numerically and chronologically, it was one migration wave layered on top of several others that came first, not the founding population the name New Scotland implies, which leaves the genetic evidence with a very specific question to answer. If all of these groups contributed roughly comparable, sometimes overlapping shares of ancestry to the modern population, why did only one of them come to define the entire province's identity? The answer has less to do with population size and more to do with timing, branding, and who got to write the story down. By the early 20th century, Nova Scotia's government and cultural institutions faced a practical problem: how to sell a distinct identity to tourists, investors, and a wave of Scottish-Canadian nostalgia sweeping across North America. The Highland story offered something the province's other founding populations didn't: an existing, exportable brand. Tartans, clan names, and Gaelic already carried romantic weight in the English-speaking world, reinforced by novels, songs, and a century of popular imagination about the vanishing Highlander. provincial officials leaned into it deliberately. Gaelic language programs, official tartans, and Highland Games festivals were formalized and promoted through much of the 1900s, cementing New Scotland as the province's public face in a way that planter, Acadian, German, Mi'kmaq, and Black Loyalist heritage never received comparable institutional support to do. Modern genetic surveys of Nova Scotia's population, drawing on both DNA testing and centuries of parish, land, and immigration records, now paint a more accurate picture than the tourism boards ever needed to tell. The population is a genuine composite, meaningful genetic contributions from Mi'kmaq ancestry stretching back thousands of years, Acadian lines that persisted quietly through and after the expulsion, New England planter descent that in many communities outweighs Highland ancestry numerically, German heritage concentrated but well documented along the South Shore, and Black Loyalist lineage carried forward through Birchtown and other communities founded in the 1780s. Highland Scottish ancestry is real, significant, and worth honoring. It simply was never the sole, or even necessarily the largest, thread in the fabric, just the one given a flag, a festival, and a name on the map. This is what the DNA actually reveals, and it isn't a story of erasure so much as one of selective amplification. Nothing about Highland heritage in Nova Scotia is false. What's incomplete is the assumption that it stood alone, when in truth it arrived last among several populations that had already spent a century and a half shaping the land, the farms, the place names, and the people who would eventually call themselves Nova Scotians. That distinction matters today for reasons beyond historical accuracy. As more residents send in DNA samples expecting confirmation of a single Highland lineage, many are instead finding Acadian surnames buried in maternal lines, Mi'kmaq ancestry their families never discussed, or planter and loyalist roots older than any tartan in their closet. The province's identity, it turns out, was never built from one people rebuilding one homeland. It was built layer by layer from several peoples who each left something permanent behind, and only one of them ever got the tourism campaign.